Ricardo arrived at the event with his eyes wide open, searching for opportunities. He didn't exactly stand out in the crowd, dressed in simple formal wear and carrying himself like an observer. But his eyes, they sparkled with an intense ambition. Among the chatter and muted laughter, he noticed her. Donna Elisa. Instantly he knew she was different from the other guests. She dressed with understated elegance, radiating refinement. Her jewelry gleamed under the lights, a quiet assertion of her status. Ricardo was captivated, observing her every move and noticing how others treated her with near reverence. She was a widow, he overheard someone say. And wealthy, very wealthy. It wasn't just the sparkle of her diamonds that drew attention but the quiet confidence in her movements, exuding a natural power. Ricardo saw an open door. A woman like her, with all her wealth and charm, was exactly what he needed to achieve his own dreams of grandeur. Carefully calculating his approach, he stepped toward her with a measured smile. "Good evening, ma'am. May I introduce myself?" "I'm Ricardo," he said, bowing slightly in a gesture of respect. Donna Elisa regarded him, assessing him for what felt like an eternity. Her gaze was enigmatic, perhaps even slightly amused, as though she understood more than she let on. Then, with a welcoming smile, she extended her hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Ricardo. It's always nice to meet polite young men at events like these." Her words were kind, but her tone carried an undercurrent of observation. This only intrigued Ricardo further. He didn't interpret her words as suspicion but as an invitation, a chance to gain her trust, and perhaps her heart. Their conversation flowed easily, and he worked hard to appear genuine, hanging on her every word. As Donna Elisa spoke of the past with a nostalgic tone, Ricardo saw only the future. His future filled with luxury and power at the side of this wealthy widow whom he believed to be vulnerable. In Ricardo's mind, the evening had just begun, and his plan was already taking shape. Ricardo executed his strategy meticulously. In the days following the event, he seized every opportunity to be near Donna Elisa. He frequently paid her casual visits, always saying, "Just wanted to check in and see how you're doing," with an innocent smile. Donna Elisa greeted him warmly, and Ricardo felt everything was proceeding exactly as he had envisioned. During their meetings, he listened with what seemed like reverence, as if every word she spoke was a rare gem. "Donna Elisa, you have such a beautiful perspective on life," he would say, his eyes shining with admiration. Whenever she mentioned something about her past, he would quickly offer a compliment. "Amazing! Your story is truly inspiring, unlike anything I've ever heard." Ricardo had learned that sweet words and genuine interest, or at least the appearance of it, were powerful tools. Yet there was something about Donna Elisa that unsettled him. Whenever he tried to push his plan further, subtly flattering her or reminding her how special she was, Donna Elisa would give him a peculiar look. Her eyes would gleam with a sharpness that made him uneasy for a fleeting moment. Then she'd smile, but that smile, it wasn't just friendly. It was as if she could see through his mask, as though she knew far more than she let on. "Ricardo, you're such a thoughtful young man," she would say, lightly stroking her teacup with delicate fingers, her gaze piercing. "It's rare to find someone who listens so attentively." Feeling a twinge of discomfort, Ricardo would simply return her smile, unaware that Donna Elisa might also be crafting her own plan. Ricardo's heart raced as he stepped through the grand gates of Donna Elisa's estate. The towering marble columns, meticulously sculpted gardens and flower-lined driveway gave the place an almost otherworldly air. Inside, his eyes were immediately drawn to the crystal chandeliers sparkling like stars on the high ceiling, the antique paintings lining the walls, each carrying a story, and the richly carved wooden furniture exuding elegance and sophistication. Though he tried to hide his amazement, inside he felt like he was walking through a palace, imagining what it would be like to live surrounded by such opulence. Donna Elisa guided him through the main hall, her gentle but firm hands gesturing toward details as she shared the stories behind each piece. Ricardo maintained a respectful demeanor, but with every step, his ambition burned hotter. He pictured himself in that setting, surrounded by wealth and influence, as though he were already staking his claim on the estate. As Ricardo took in his surroundings with careful eyes, Donna Elisa observed him from the corner of her gaze, studying every expression and every glimmer of fascination he couldn't quite hide, no matter how hard he tried. "So, Ricardo, what do you think of my humble home?" she asked with a serene smile, though the sparkle in her eyes hinted at a deeper significance behind the question. Ricardo smiled, striving to temper his enthusiasm, replying with calculated politeness, unaware of the subtle game his hostess had begun to play. Ricardo's confidence grew with each passing day. He started visiting the mansion more frequently, offering to help Donna Elisa with small tasks, listening to her stories with feigned attentiveness, and even placing a gentle hand on her shoulder as if to present himself as someone she could trust. He praised her for the way she managed the business her late husband had left behind and insisted that her company was one of the few things that truly brought him joy. Donna Elisa listened, responded with cordial smiles, and graciously acknowledged his gestures, appearing receptive to the affection he demonstrated. Yet, with every word exchanged, there was something in her eyes, a glimmer of cunning that surfaced in fleeting, discreet moments. She replied with a touch of irony, slipping in remarks about the unpredictability of life and the value of genuine friendships, leaving behind subtle hints as though testing his comprehension. Ricardo, blinded by his ambition, interpreted her comments as signs he was on the right track, seeing every response as another door opening to further his approach. "You remind me so much of my late husband when he was young," Donna Elisa said with a calculated calmness. Ricardo took it as a compliment, unaware that she was carefully watching him, assessing how far he would go with his schemes. He, on the other hand, smiled with satisfaction, confident that his performance was flawless, failing to realize he was already a player in a far more intricate game than he could imagine. One quiet afternoon, as the two sipped tea in the lavishly decorated sitting room, Donna Elisa leaned slightly toward Ricardo, her enigmatic smile setting the tone for what seemed like a casual conversation. She asked about his childhood, his hometown, and eventually, some of the struggles he'd mentioned facing before moving to the city. Ricardo, relaxed as ever, responded with his usual self-assurance, weaving stories that painted his life as one of challenges and triumphs. But then Donna Elisa paused. Locking eyes with him, she asked with an unexpectedly precise tone, "And how was your experience working at that corner bar for 2 years before coming here?" The question struck Ricardo like an alarm. He had never mentioned that job to her or anyone else in their social circle. His body stiffened, and he tried to mask his discomfort with a quick smile, stammering a vague reply about it being a passing phase. But Donna Elisa continued to watch him, her eyes gleaming with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. "It's curious, Ricardo," she said, stirring her tea with a calm demeanor. "We often try so hard to leave parts of our past behind, but the past has a peculiar way of following us, doesn't it?" Ricardo let out a forced laugh, but inside, a storm was brewing. For the first time, he began to suspect that Donna Elisa was far from the naive widow he had assumed her to be. Perhaps she knew more about him than she let on. Her words echoed in his mind, stirring a growing unease as he realized he might be caught in a web intricately woven by someone far more perceptive than he had imagined. Sitting alone in his modest apartment, Ricardo replayed every step that had brought him to this point. He recalled his first conversations with Donna Elisa, the warm glow she exhibited when speaking about her life and memories, and, above all, her immense generosity. Each smile, each gentle glance from her seemed to echo in his mind now, as though silently questioning him, "How far are you willing to go?" For a fleeting moment, he imagined a life without his relentless ambition, envisioning himself as nothing more than a genuine friend to Donna Elisa. She was one of the few people who made him feel truly seen, and he admired her sharp intelligence and compassion, qualities he himself had rarely encountered. This newfound respect shook the foundation of his determination, as if a part of his conscience was seeking a reason to abandon his plans. But the promise of wealth and a life of luxury pulled him back as strong as ever. He was Soklos. Every carefully chosen word, every deliberate step, had brought him nearer to the future he had dreamed of. The prospect of success was within reach, and the urgency of that dream reignited his resolve. With a deep breath, Ricardo decided to press forward. He pushed aside the doubts and intrusive thoughts. Yet, deep down, he knew those doubts wouldn't be so easily silenced. In the quiet stillness of the mansion's living room, where only the faint ticking of an antique clock echoed, Ricardo sensed a shift in the air. Sitting with impeccable posture and an expression that balanced serenity and sharp insight, Donna Elisa looked directly at him. With a calm tone, she began to speak. "Ricardo," she said, her voice as precise as a scalpel, "did you really think I wouldn't notice your intentions from the very start?" He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to maintain his composure. But her next words disarmed him entirely. "Since I first met you, I noticed something in your eyes. You were searching for something, but it was never my friendship, was it?" She let out a faint smile, more of a confirmation than a question. Ricardo tried to stammer out a reply, but the widow pressed on, firm and assured. "I didn't get this far by being naive," she continued, her sharp gaze unwavering. "Wealth is just one part of life, and it only has value when paired with character and respect. You, Ricardo, are young and think you can achieve everything without integrity. But you're mistaken. Ricardo felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He was exposed, his lies, his intentions, all laid bare. His face flushed with shame as he tried to hold his composure, but Dona Elisa's piercing gaze held him captive. He wanted to respond but knew there was nothing he could say to escape the situation. Maintaining her serene demeanor, Dona Elisa delivered her final blow. You could have chosen the path of truth, but instead, you chose deception. Now, learn that life demands a heavy price from those who fail to honor honesty. She rose gracefully, leaving Ricardo engulfed in an oppressive silence. Her words echoed in his mind, cutting deeper than any physical punishment. He realized too late that he had underestimated the strength of a woman like Dona Elisa. Ricardo left the mansion with heavy steps, his head bowed, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. The cold night air seemed to mock his defeat, and the streetlights, once inviting, now only highlighted his shame. He stopped at a small bench in a nearby square, sitting down as if the weight of the world bore down on his shoulders. Staring at the ground, reality struck him with brutal force. Dona Elisa's words reverberated in his mind, each phrase a blow to his already fragile self-esteem. He felt like a fool, not just for being exposed but for realizing the depth of his greed and the emptiness of his actions. How did it come to this? He murmured, his voice barely audible. He thought about his childhood, the values his parents had tried to instill in him, values he had discarded in favor of shortcuts to success. He recalled every excuse he had made to justify his choices, every time he told himself that the ends justified the means. But now, faced with the stark truth, there was no escaping it. He wasn't a victim of Dona Elisa or his circumstances. He was a victim of his own blind ambition. The night's chill began to seep into his skin, but Ricardo didn't move. He knew this was a defining moment. For the first time in a long while, he looked at himself honestly and saw the painful truth. Dona Elisa, standing with her usual poise and a mix of disappointment and compassion in her eyes, walked with Ricardo to the mansion's door. He followed in silence, still grappling with the bitter truths she had laid before him. When they reached the door, she stopped, turned slowly and looked him directly in the eye. "Ricardo," she began, her voice calm but firm, "life is made of choices. And every choice comes with consequences. The path you tried to take, of deceit and shortcuts, may seem easy but it never leads to peace, nor to respect, nor to true success." He swallowed hard, unable to respond. "Building something with your own hands, through effort and honesty, is what gives life meaning. Everything I have today," she continued, gesturing subtly toward the grand mansion behind her, "means nothing without the dignity of knowing it was earned with integrity. I hope one day you understand that." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Ricardo felt small in her presence, not because of her wealth or power, but because of her unwavering strength of character. "Thank you," he whispered, barely finding the words. Dona Elisa offered a faint smile and opened the door. "Take this lesson to heart, Ricardo, and do something better with your life." He stepped outside, the weight of the closing door behind him marking the end of a chapter. Walking through the city streets, his former arrogance replaced by a humbled spirit, he found himself haunted by a single question with every step. Who do I want to become from now on? As the night wind swirled around him, Ricardo began to grasp something he had never understood before. True wealth wasn't found in possessions but in character. It wasn't about what he could take from others, but about what he could build with his own efforts. That night, the ambitious young man who had entered the mansion with dubious plans disappeared. In his place, a man emerged, burdened by the weight of his mistakes but carrying the potential to become someone better. Months passed, but Dona Elisa's words continued to echo in Ricardo's mind. At first, he tried to drown them out in the noise of routine, to bury his shame beneath distractions, but the lessons seemed to follow him everywhere. In quiet moments, especially at night, he found himself face to face with a version of himself he could no longer ignore. A young man who had sold himself out to illusions of shortcuts and easy wealth. Determined to change, Ricardo took his first steps toward a new path. With effort, he found a modest job at a small bookstore in the city center. It wasn't the luxurious future he had once envisioned, but for the first time, Ricardo felt pride when he received his paycheck, knowing that every cent had been earned honestly. The store's customers were ordinary people, but their stories, conversations, and smiles taught him something his ambitious plans never had: the value of human connections and the small victories of everyday life. One afternoon, while organizing books on a shelf, he came across a worn-out copy with the title Building a True Life. It felt as though the book had been waiting for him. He sat on the bench by the window and read the first few pages, soaking in every word. Ricardo didn't become wealthy, but something within him had changed forever. He now understood that the most painful experiences are often the ones that teach the greatest lessons, that failures and setbacks aren't the end, but invitations to begin again, this time with greater wisdom. As the golden light of the sunset poured through the bookstore window, Ricardo smiled to himself. He was no longer the young man who had tried to deceive Dona Elisa. He was someone stronger, more humble, more authentic. And for the first time he felt he was on the right path. Did you like the story? Comment below what you thought of this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.